I think I'll try to make this a little bit more interactive. First and foremost, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak. I feel a little bit out of place, but I will try my best to do justice to this invitation to talk. First and foremost, again, sorry for my slides. It is certainly not as pretty as the previous two slides, but at the very least, you know that I did it myself. So a lot of the areas have been covered. I will try my best not to cover the same areas again, and I will just stick to what I think are the crucial points. Also, what you have written there as my topic, I was told by James to ignore that and to talk on what he told me to talk. So if you find that there is a... Yes. And if you find that it does not tally with the topic, don't worry. It will still fit into the whole context of everything that we're talking about. So we've already talked about MA63 and what it is. The best way of explaining it, because I do realize that there are a lot of non-lawyers here, we always take it for granted that we are lawyers and we can understand things. No, it's not. MA63, I realize when you go to the public, it's not easy to understand, okay? When you talk about the federal constitution, I know myself, it took me a long time to even try to make sense of the constitution. It is a very difficult piece of legislation. It is complex because it keeps referring to different schedules, subject to this, different parts, and so on and so forth. You need, I don't know how many different copies of one thing in order to try to make sense of it by referring to different parts and reading it all together. I'm sure YB, Datuk Sri Madius knows, because when he's in Parliament, he's got, I don't know how many copies he has. It's not easy to make sense of it. So I will try to keep it simple so that everyone who are not lawyers will be able to understand. So simple terms, MA63. I always say this, and I'll use this as an analogy again. MA63 is basically the promises made when we were being wooed to join Malaysia, okay? It literally was that. A lot of people know that when Malaya came to Sabah and Sarawak, they took the Sabah and Sarawak leaders to West Malaysia to look at how wonderfully developed they were, with the promise that you will be like this as well if you join Malaysia. Okay, so that was a promise. So that was the wooing. Okay, and we all know when we are dating, we make a lot of promises. Now, yes, and when you marry, those promises must be kept. Okay, so that was essentially it. So what you had was you had promises when we were dating that this is how it's going to work, and this is what essentially the MA63 is. So in simple terms, they were to ensure that Sabah and Sarawak kept its own identity, because obviously we were separate areas that formed Malaysia. And it was to guarantee that Sabah and Sarawak kept its rights to a certain degree. Now, a lot of things have been, a lot of people mentioned about the 20 points, okay? And by the way, I am only going to be talking about Sabah, mostly. From time to time again, I'll talk about Sarawak, but mostly about Sabah. So I do not make any promises that I will say anything about Sarawak, because I see a lot of dignitaries here who know much more about Sarawak. Okay, so what are the 20 points? We talk about it, but do we know what they really are? And you know what? I actually had to go and download this, find it, and to put it here so that it reminds me what it actually is. So let's have a quick look at what it is. These are some of the 20 points. I will digress. I will go into different areas as we go along to show you where along the way the 20 points have not been kept. So this is the next 5 points. I want to talk a little bit about immigration, because the latest hot topic is about MM2H. So MM2H, Sabah and Sarawak has their own versions of MM2H. And this would fall under the immigration 20-point area. So what does the MM2H actually do? As you would know, it is about being able to control who comes into your territory and onto your land. And when you come to your land, you give them certain privileges. For example, extended stay, whether it's a visa to stay, permanent residence, or just a visa to stay for 5 years. And this is pursuant basically to the immigration point. Now, you also have the federal government telling you that your regulations are not in line with the federal requirements, and therefore you cannot implement it. That is complete, utter nonsense. Okay? Why is it nonsense? Why is it nonsense? Because whenever we speak, we must speak with some knowledge. Okay? It's easy to say it's nonsense, but why is it nonsense? Well, very simply put, there are no laws on MM2H. Okay? It's not even a law. All right? What it is you have, and this is unfortunately how a lot of government actually works. They have things like circulars, and the power of circular is unfortunately amazing. The civil service treats circulars as laws. No, they're not. Okay? Circulars have got no force of law. However, the civil service treats it like law. So they will tell you that this is how it is, but there is no basis for it, except maybe there is a circular somewhere. Okay? But the circular does not have the force of law. So remember this. So when we talk about MM2H, what we are talking about is essentially immigration laws. Okay? Because you're allowing someone to come, you're allowing someone to stay here for 5 years, 2 years, 3 years, whatever. Doesn't matter. It's immigration laws. And under the Federation, under the Federal Constitution, immigration, obviously for Sabah and Sarawak, we have authority over who enters our land. And because of that, it also means we can regulate and give certain terms and conditions, whether, for example, you have to buy in Sabah, you have to buy a 600,000 piece of property in order for you to get your 5-year MM2H. We can allow these sort of things. We can set the regulations. So when the federal government said, oh, your regulation is not in line with ours, we have to use our federal agents and all of these things, just remember, it was never law. Okay? In fact, MOTAC's claim to have authority over the whole thing is also suspicious. Okay? It effectively was tasked to implement MM2H, but it has no legal force of law to implement MM2H because it doesn't even exist. It is just a policy. It is a policy that was designed by Malaysia in order to attract investors, but never any laws were enacted for it. So this is an example how, as we go through in time, you will find policies, you will find circulars which are put in, and if we do not know what our rights are, they will be diluted. Okay? So always bear in mind what is knowledge. Always bear in mind, have knowledge so that you know how to argue when people talk to you about, oh, federal government has got powers over this or not. So these are the next 10. And this is the next 5. When we touch on the tariffs and finance part, I wanted to quickly talk about another area which has been in the news as well, and which is development grant and special grant. Special grant is unique to Sabah and Sarawak, as all of you should know by now. Development grant actually needs to be given to everyone in Malaysia, all the states. Okay? However, these things are always confused as being one and the same. They are not. Every state in Malaysia has the right to receive development grants. That is exactly what a federation is. A federation is federated to a federal government, a central government, and the central government's task is to make sure that the states receive development grant to develop the state. That's why it's called a development grant. Okay? So there's nothing unique about a development grant. A development grant is something that every state receives. But what is unique is the special grant. So if you walk away with nothing else today, just remember, development grant and special grant are two different things. Okay? So we, Sabah and Sarawak, gets both. Okay? Development grant and special grant. No other states in Malaysia, except for Sabah and Sarawak, receives these two things. Everyone gets development grants, but Sabah and Sarawak is the only two states that get the special grant. So as I earlier said, these 20 points were basically what was designed to ensure that Sabah retains its unique status, rights, and interests, and to ensure that they are protected within Malaysia, allowing for a fair degree of autonomy and governance. So if we had a dream list of what we could do to change the constitution, to make it better, in line with the 20 points, what could we ask for? The first one, obviously, would be greater financial autonomy. And what would I do with this? We can amend what laws are necessary to be in line with a special grant. What would that look like? That would look like this. As we all know, what happens now is this. The federal government collects taxes. The federal government may or may not give you your 40% ever. But if we can keep the taxes, collect the taxes in Sabah, and then give the 60% to the federal government, then we will make sure we receive and retain the 40%. So if I could change to make sure that the federal constitution is in line with the 20 points, in line with MA63, that would be one of it. To make sure that we are the collectors of the taxes and that the 40%, the 40% remains with Sabah, and then the 60% can then be given to to federal government. What that would mean is be no more fights about what that 40% actually is. Okay? Very simple. Moving forward, that's what we should do, and that's what we should aim to do. Moving backwards, that is the subject of the court case, and I'll talk a little bit more about later. Earlier on, I talked about immigration. Practical problem with MM2H is this. Yes, Sabah and Sarawak can put its own laws, I won't say laws, put its own policy, okay, and say that I want to give 5-year visa to, not visa, 5-year stay permits, passes, or whatever, to these group of people subject to these terms and conditions. Yes, we can. However, reality is this. Will the Immigration Department, which is a federal body, issue those passes? That is a question that will need to be answered, because there are only that many different types of passes. And it'd be odd if, for example, the federal headquarters says, no, there will be no such passes that will be issued by the Immigration Department, but the state insists. When you think about this problem, you will realize that this is unfortunately the issue when it comes to a lot of federal-state disagreements. At the end of the day, you may have the right to do what you want. However, whether or not you can enforce it, because the machinery is with the federal government, that is a question. So if I had a chance to amend the constitution, what would I do? I would probably make sure that the immigration department, when they are in Sabah, can obviously issue its own passes without having to go to the federal government. Okay, so this would be in line with the 20 points earlier on that I showed you. Then we talk about separate judicial system. One area that maybe a lot of you do not understand and do not know is this. In order for one of the courts in Sabah and Sarawak to do anything, whether or not they want to rent out the space, whether or not they want to fix the toilet, whether or not they want to buy paper for the photocopying machine, they have to go to Palace of Justice, the Chief Registrar's office, and ask, hi, I need money for paper, for the photocopier, can I have it? Because the allocation is given that way. So we have a separate High Court in Sabah and Sarawak, but this High Court in Sabah and Sarawak, whatever fines, so all of you, for example, today you get into, you park illegally outside here. Okay, the gentleman was very nice to remind you to move your car, but in other places you get fined. So then you go to court, assuming you don't compound with the police. You go to court and then you pay the fine. Okay, that fine will go into consolidated funds and it will go to the federal government. And Sabah, the high courts in Sabah and Sarawak go back to the federal Palace of Justice and say, can I have money to buy paper for the photocopier? Okay, so imagine this. How does that reduce us to what? Obviously, if I had my way, we would make sure the High Court in Sabah and Sarawak has the financial means, the financial control over things like renting even a vending machine themselves. At the moment, if they want to rent a space for the vending machine, they have to go to Palace of Justice and ask, how much is that space? And Palace of Justice has to tell them that space is how much, and then they have to say, I've got this person who's interested, can I rent it out to them? Obviously, not a lot of autonomy. Then, appointment of JCs. That's very, very important. Do you know how many JCs there are? Sorry, I won't say JCs. Do you know how many judges in the Court of Appeal from Sabah at the moment? Guess. Actually, the honest answer is 0. Okay? We have Datuk Ravi, who has been in Sabah for a very, very long time. So we consider him to be a Sabahan. All right? He's married to a Sabahan. But in reality, there are 0 Sabah judges. Okay? So what you will find as you go up, so when I talk about the high appellate courts, I'm talking about the Court of Appeal and the Federal Court. There are 0 Sabah judges. Obviously, not very fair. I've always advocated, and I advocate this, and I'll suggest it here as well. There should be a quota for Sabah and Sarawak judges. And this quota should be perhaps equal. So how would this work? You can imagine there are, I was told there are 32 Court of Appeal positions under the Constitution. 32 Court of Appeal judges. Out of that, maybe 1/3 of them should be Sabah and Sarawak judges. And now those 1/3 equally shared between Sabah and Sarawak. Why is this important? Of course it is. When you have laws being made by judges who are from Semenanjung or Sabah and Sarawak, it has an effect on how these laws are interpreted and how these laws are applied to Malaysia. So that's what is on my wish list of things that I could change if I could with the Constitution. Then, what would I also change? Education. I know we're talking about this later, but I want to raise this here also now. Why is Malaysia in this position? I just finished, Dr. Johan, I just finished reading your book on the plane, right? That was my task, to read your book, going to KL and coming back here. I thought I'd read it. I finally finished reading it. And he talks a lot about it in the book as well, which is this. The history of Malaysia, unfortunately, has been taught to everybody, which is August 31st, Merdeka, Merdeka, Merdeka. You have been taught about the Indian, the Hindu empire coming down in Malayan history, I should say. Okay, Malayan history, Majapahit, and all of those. That's what you have been taught in your history classes. They will not tell you about MA63. They will not tell you about the formation of Malaysia, equal partners. They do not teach you all of these things. So these obviously are crucial in order for Malaysians in general, because by the way, if you go to Malaya, if you go to West Malaysia and you talk about MA63, you know how they view it? They view it like this. They'll view it as we East Malaysians make a lot of noise and we use MA63 as the excuse to make all of these noises. That's how they view it. They do not understand MA63, but they will, and that the reason why they don't MA63 is because it was not taught in the schools. So if I had a say in how to change the constitution, I will make sure that education would be clearly under Sabah and Sarawak's control so that we can finally make a difference in terms of history and also, for example, English, which Sarawak is already doing. And obviously, Sabah should be doing that as well because English is important in the world. Not to say that it's more important than BM, but it is very important because without that, we're not going to get very far being competitive in the world. What else would I try to change? We have spoken about the territorial waters. In essence, just to dial back what it actually means, it was there early on, but skipped over. Before Malaysia was formed, Sabah and Sarawak already had its boundaries. The boundaries were 12 nautical miles, so that was already set. And when we formed Malaysia, the federal constitution basically says, your boundaries are the same as it was before the formation of Malaysia, meaning 12 nautical miles. And after the formation of Malaysia, if you want to amend the boundaries, you need the state's consent. Well, basically, it was amended. The boundaries were retracted to 3 nautical miles, isn't it? It's 3. Yes. Retracted to 3 or 2, and without the state's consent. So this is basically the problem with what the territorial seas is about. And then what I have also learned from Sarawak, and this is something that I urge the Sabah government to do, is this. Sarawak looks at the legislation. Sarawak challenges the legislation. For example, how? Sarawak's land laws to essentially say that anything down and up is under the Sarawak land laws. Down and up. How high up goes? Nobody knows. Okay, but down and up. What that would actually mean is this. The telco spectrum is claimed for by Sarawak. Is it right? Is it wrong? Does it matter? What it matters is, at least Sarawak is doing it. They're making a claim for it. Because land is obviously under Sarawak and it's under Sabah as well. But Sarawak is going even one step higher, which is everything up is also Sarawak's. Okay? But that's what we should do in Sabah. That's what we should do in Sabah, because we should have those make those claims or not. The only way it can be undone is if someone declares it unconstitutional, and then they would have to go to court to do that. Will the federal government take you to court for doing this? When they need you to balance them in government? Maybe not. So areas not yet fulfilled. Obviously, the MA63 that everyone's talking about, the 40% claim, the special right claim, that's not fulfilled. And that is subject to the court action that is going on as well. The other area is the development grants, which I'd like to explain very quickly here. I hear the bell, is this. Development grants, what you see in the budget every year, 6 billion, 5 billion, however many billions. That money does not come into the pockets of the state. Okay? This is something that a lot of people may not understand. A lot of people think the federal government announces 5 billion for Sabah, 5 billion for Sarawak. That means that I get $5 billion and then I have $5 billion to use. No, you don't get that $5 billion. The $5 billion is a promise you can use up to $5 billion. But that $5 billion would mean that you have to be ready to use that money. Okay? You have to be ready to use that money, meaning you have done your studies, you're ready to implement it, you're ready to go. Okay? But you do not get that 5 million kept in the pockets. So what would you want to do? Sabah has said that we should have a trust fund which the federal government pays that promised $5 billion into to make sure that when we come round next year, we have the money. Because if not, this is what happens. I am told that only 30% of 20 to 30% of what is promised to you is ever used in any given 1 year. Which means the 70% that is not used will come back again next year in your 5 billion promise. Okay? So you see how this works? Every year you think you get $5 billion. No, you don't. There is no $5 billion. It's an illusion. It's a promise of $5 billion. You only get part of that $5 billion, and you hope next the $5 billion will be there. But there's no guarantee, no promise that the $5 billion, the balance of the $5 billion will come again. So what would be a good way of doing it? A trust fund. And the reason about the public service Borneoization is essentially this. It's to make sure that policies are driven and implemented by people who actually understand Sabah and Sarawak. Clearly, we are very different from how West Malaysia operates, and Borneoization will ensure that policies are actually reflective of the needs of Sabah and Sarawak. Okay, very quickly, update on the SLS special grant action. As alluded to by Dr. Jeffrey, yes, it has been appealed to. It has been the leave to appeal to the federal court is there. And unfortunately, whilst it's in the federal court, the High Court is taking a stance of deal with the federal court first, and then you move on to the substantive hearing. How sincere is that? When the real issue is only about locus and whether or not it's justiciable, meaning the court can look into it and decide. And this has been decided emphatically by the High Court. Yes, can. Court of Appeal gave an even stronger grounds. Definitely can. And then we are now before the federal court. And the federal government is saying that it is not justiciable and there is no standing, no locus. Okay? So how sincere is this in remedying the special grant? And I just wanted to quickly point out how important public engagement is. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's see whether or not. Okay, this was spoken about earlier, so I won't go there. Maybe I'll just let people take a photo of this. Take a photo of this.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, I'm told I have to stop there. So
All right,
thank you
okay.
very much.